Hello, Lyceans. Welcome again to another presentation of Philosophy Today. My name is Mr. Philip James Esminosa of the Lyceum of the Philippines University from the College of International Relations and the College of Arts and Sciences. So, for today's lecture, which is part 2 of our previous discussion, is entitled Nietzsche on the Transvaluation of Values, an antidote to nihilism. So I just want to remind everyone that in this discussion, what I want you to do is also refer to the book What Nietzsche Really Said by Robert Solomon and Kathleen Higgins. There is a chapter there entitled God is Dead, and I will focus on the idea of nihilism and how does it actually work, in particular in the Christian tradition. So my discussion points will include the following: what Nietzsche dislikes or condemns about Christianity, and how does nihilism work within that tradition. Again, nihilism is the condition in which values devaluate themselves or tend to lose their meaning. Values tend to lose its meaning or its significance when the categories of good and bad, or the categories of right and wrong, are not attuned anymore, or does not correspond to the actualities of our experience, or the circumstances that we're actually living in. So Nietzsche insisted on the idea of the transvaluation of values, or a reconfiguration of our notions of good and bad, or right and wrong, or good and evil, in order for us to have an affirmation of life. I will also discuss Nietzsche's spiritual alternative, which focuses on the idea of what he admires in the Christian tradition. So, again, as I've mentioned in an earlier discussion, Nietzsche as an atheist is not an all out critique of the Christian tradition, but he is quite selective about what he criticizes. Which is actually a good practice. You cannot just accept everything that is fed to you. That's the point of what Nietzsche's philosophy is. Instead, we should practice an ethos or an ethics of life in which we are selective of what we believe in and what we value, and look deeply into the meaning and how are we supposed to somehow live out the demands of those values. So these are ideas that we impose upon ourselves because it allows us to act freely in accordance to those values or to those ideals. This will be followed by an ethical dilemma that I will present in the end of the discussion. In this way, again, the idea of practicing theory or mixing theory with practice, or somehow enveloping theory into actual circumstances. So it's a way for us to see how they actually work. So theories, again, are dead if you do not get to see them work in the actualities of life. So before I proceed with the discussion, I want to introduce everyone to the crucial text where these crucial ideas are actually found. Again, just a sort of review. The idea of the death of God is something that he pronounced in the book The Gay Science, or The Joyful Science, or Wissenschaft. Nietzsche calls for a restoration of a sense of innocence to our natural experience. By that, what he actually means is that there are certain values that we hold that are antithetical or are against our instincts. Instincts are not bad, but the bad thing about is if it's not something that we develop or harness in the long run. So that's the essence of education. Our natural impulses needs to be cultivated, but there are certain forces in our modern society, including religion, for example, as Nietzsche cited, that somehow doesn't hold this idea of cultivation of our instincts or expressing them in a more refined way, but rather they tend to destroy our instincts. It's a complete obliteration of it and not a development that goes through the process of careful or gradual cultivation or refinement. It is in this book that Nietzsche pronounces God is dead. The Christian worldview is no longer real in the sense that it does not provide these certainties it once provided um, in the pre-modern times. For that, he provides a natural suggestion to develop our sense of meaning in the modern world and to counter nihilism. Idea is also extended in the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And what is new to this book is that idea of the will to power, which is a psychological motivation in achieving the ideal type of man or individual, which is the Ubermensch. Ubermensch is what we call the overman or the superman. Do not take it literally. You cannot be Superman. What he actually means here is the individual who develops a sense of achieving higher types of learning or higher types of individuality, and not just live a life of mediocrity or naivety. The ideal of human development, devoid of timidity, in contrast, is what he calls the last man. That is a person who is risk averse or who avoids difficulties. And what he's actually hinting here is the essential role that hardships play in that development of being an excellent individual. Being, when I say excellent individual, it could be anything: a good teacher, an excellent teacher, an excellent chef, or an excellent tour guide, or an excellent diplomat, anything. But what he is actually referring to is you need to develop yourselves, or you need to take seriously that idea of becoming the best version of yourself. And becoming that type of individual cannot be achieved if we are not gonna take difficulties as an essential ingredient in the process. So there are forces in our modern world which he calls religion of comfortableness, where these forces, whether it's found in our culture, you can see it, for example, in the culture industry of advertisements, advertising a difficult, free or risk-free of obtaining or achieving things. Let's say, for example, education nowadays. That idea of student-centered learning, which is often misinterpreted or misunderstood. Sometimes we push it too far to the point that we equate student-centered learning where the student dictates everything to the point of dictating what grade that he wants. And even though it's something that he or she does not deserve, but since he equates it to the idea of exchange value or buying education, his or her understanding is he or she is buying his or her grade. But that's not supposed to be the case. You're not buying excellence here. You need to develop that individuality in you, and it has to go through that process of learning, which includes the ingredient of hardships. Readings, for example, making the essay, making the deadlines. Yes, of course, these are things that are essential to learning. But sometimes we want to take the quick route to the point that we want to avoid these things. And in the end, we hold the title graduate. Wow. This is something that, just to read an essential quote coming from that book. Man is something that shall be overcome. Man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. End of quote. The next essential book of Nietzsche is entitled Beyond Good and Evil. In this book, Nietzsche further explores the notion of transvaluation of values, or the re-evaluation of values, and castigates Immanuel Kant's notion of absolute values. When I say absolute values, these are, without a doubt, universal values that apply to all cultures in all actual circumstances. And somehow this is something to learn earlier, how to balance particularity of the circumstances with the demand of universality. Um, Something that I want to emphasize in this course is that you cannot be too far in each of the side, whether it's particularity or universality. Somehow you always need to look into the mean, or the middle path. Um, but the middle path is something that I always locate in actual circumstances. Does the actual circumstance demand its particularity, or does it demand its universality? Nietzsche calls for new philosophers or new thinkers who would create new values through a process of open minded experimentation. And when you say open minded experimentation, sometimes we are so fascinated with our categories of understanding. In particular, what he's actually hinting here is the categories of good and bad. He actually plays on the ambiguities of these categories or classifications. They actually somehow work as rubrics. They are not. This is the message he wants us to internalize. The idea of good and evil are not exclusive terms, in the sense that we have on the one side good and on the other we have evil, or what is wrong. But he actually blurs these categories. Take, for example, if you are a fan of the HBO series Game of Thrones, in the last season, where Daenerys Targaryen sacked King's Landing, this is something that everyone who is actually in the side of the Targaryens and the Starks is actually waiting for, that idea of returning or reclaiming what is due to them. But in the process, you will see somehow the categories of good and evil are not as simple as that, because somehow the way that Daenerys reclaimed her throne included the idea of building life through communities of death, or killing the inhabitants of King's Landing just to meet the end of reclaiming what is due to her. So if you're looking to that uh, good way of depicting it, um, the way that the idea of good and evil you will observe somehow are somehow reversed. Somehow, um, Daenerys is not the protagonist anymore. He became, or she became, the villain in those circumstances where the population is actually burning. And that's also in a similar vein, or by way of analogy, what Nietzsche is actually pointing out here. Let us not be too rigid or too dogmatic in our understanding that good and evil are exact categories that do not change. And he wants us to see the object of our experience and not just the concept that we impose on experience, or the concept of good and evil that we impose to circumstances. Somehow, those concepts that we hold in our head will diminish if we look on to the actual circumstances and how they actually uh, would redefine the concepts that we hold in our head. And last, one of the important books is on the genealogy of morals. Nietzsche analyzes the origin of moral values. And what he wants to emphasize here is that our categories of good and evil actually has a history. And when we say history, uh, there is the process of development, and it's there is this idea of what is defined as good in a previous epoch or an era may not necessarily be something that uh, is similarly understood in the present age, or our present age might somehow the present age and the values that we have may somehow be redefined in order for us to create what we envision to be a better future. And there are two contrasting forms of morality, according to Nietzsche, and this is the master morality, the self assertive or assured individual, and the slavish or slave like type of morality, which devalues the former, or the idea of a weak willed individual. So, again, this is something that he wants to emphasize in his philosophy, the idea of a strong character. You can actually equate strong character with the master morality, someone who is not limited only into the categories or concepts of good and evil, but is bold enough to reconfigure those categories or those concepts because because of the actual circumstances that he actually is addressing. Master morality do not question the value of their own way of living, and they know how to live their life. Or this is what we call living life authentically in existential terms. They consider those who are not masters of their lives to be base or bad, because the slave do not live their life in accordance to what they want, but they live their life envious of other people's lives. They always compare their lives to others, and this is something that happens because what is working in him is that feeling of resentment, or Nietzsche calls ressentiment. If you live life out of resentment, your tendency is to not look into your own way of leading the path towards happiness or towards a productive or a strong character individual. But instead, you tend to look on others' achievements and become envious. And in the process, it actually poisons you. And I hope you got that idea. In contrast, the slave morality are those who resent the masters and are discontent with their conditions. They are motivated by hostility and deems the master and everything they stand for as evil. So there you go. That idea of good and evil. You tend to look at the strong-willed and or the strong character of another individual who actually live up to the master morality and the values that he holds that actually contribute to his greatness or her greatness is something that you castigate and something that you look upon as evil because you cannot do it on your own. That's a simple fact. So instead of doing it, and because you're afraid of doing it, you tend to classify the values that he or she hold as evil. That is how resentment works in an individual who does not live in accordance to his or her own will. Okay? So let's just revisit the idea of God is dead. For Nietzsche, the death of God signifies that humanity has reached a point in history where the belief in God has become unbelievable. It is not only religious faith that collapsed. Everything that has been built on this faith will now be shaken to its core. So we must consider the Christian religion, or whatever religion that is. The only reason why we're discussing Christianity here, Nietzsche doesn't mean that it's only exclusively found in Christianity, but that's something that he's familiar with, and I think most of us are familiar with. That's why he chose Christianity as an example that has nihilistic tendencies. Going back to the point, Christianity is a system. It's just not belief in a God, but also what are the values enshrined in that belief system. So if we had that idea of the death of God, if we lose faith to God and we find it unbelievable anymore, its features that surrounds it will also be shaken, will also be rethought and reconsidered, or needs to be rethought and reconsidered. Remember that the death of God includes three facets or three features. What has died is the way that we interpret history as something that is governed by a divine reason and the testimony of a universal moral world order. What we now have is a state of vertigo wherein the certainties of moral values seems to lose its hold or seems to diminish, and the death of absolute values or absolute truth with a capital T somehow is dwindling. Another idea that is part of that system that died is the Christian notion of human nature. The Christian notion of human nature holds that idea of essence precedes existence, or before you were even born, there is already a predetermined plan for you as an individual. God knows beforehand what will happen to you, and this is the idea of predestination coming from John Calvin, the Protestant Christian theologian. Instead, what Nietzsche um, said or argued, the death of God now reconfigured or reverses that idea of essence precedes existence. Instead, we have the idea of existence precedes essence. We exist first in this world, and through the process of living it, we come to define through our choices and through our freedom what is the most meaningful way for us to live our lives. Therefore, the idea that Nietzsche stresses is the will is not external from us, but it is rather within us. It is human will. Life is the will to power, which requires the work of a free spirit. A free spirit is a term that Nietzsche uses to refer to an individual who has that ability to rethink and reevaluate values because he or she is not confined or restricted to its simple definitions. The death of God signifies a reaffirmation of our freedom. Remember, however, that the death of God is also a calamitous crisis, which implies the emergence of an emptiness where certainties once existed. This created an atmosphere that life is entirely meaningless, or this is now the idea of nihilism. Nietzsche is not celebrating entirely this idea of the death of God. Instead, it serves as a warning for humanity on how it is supposed to own up the responsibility to create new values for the new world of modernity. So, just to clarify, just to add more to that idea, is that Nietzsche is not completely celebrating. And this is something that he always practiced, the idea of perspectivism. You should look into an object of inquiry from a multiplicity of perspectives, not only in a one-dimensional way. So you should know how to look at its good points and its bad points as well. Having a one-dimensional thought, on the other hand, is looking only at it in one way, or having only one-track minds, or having a one-track mind. So perspectivism allows you to see that, just by analogy, the world is not or should not be seen with a set of eyeglasses with only one color. Let's say, for example, that the color of your eyeglasses is red. You see things practically in red. Instead, when you take off those glasses, you will see that the world is not only made out of the color red. It's made out of a kaleidoscope or a multiplicity of colors. And in order for you to see that in a similar vein, by way of analogy, that's what we mean by perspectivism or pluralism. A plurality of perspectives. So now I would like you to open the book by Robert Solomon, particularly in the chapter God is Dead. And as I discuss, I will somehow guide you on the essential points of that chapter. So the chapter is in chapter 3. Nietzsche said God is dead. It's actually found on page 84. What I want you to look into is in page 86, why Nietzsche condemns Christianity. Again, this discussion will discuss or focus on the idea of nihilism within the tradition of Christianity. Okay, and then later on, let's see how nihilism works not only in Christianity but other cultural realities that Nietzsche would describe as something that is also found in our modern culture. Okay, so the idea of God is an essential thing that we need to understand from Nietzsche's way of exposing it. And this is something that he got or received by reading the book The Essence of Christianity by Ludwig Feuerbach. And Ludwig Feuerbach says that the divine essence is nothing but the human essence. Okay? God is not only an actual reality. We're not looking into that because, agnostically speaking, we cannot know that. Okay? But what Nietzsche is describing here is the cultural idea that we made out of God as an actually existing being. The human creation of God, or what we call the anthropological concept of God. And when you look at the anthropological concept of God, that's what we mean by the divine essence is nothing but the human essence. What that means is anything that we attribute to God, God as merciful, God as loving, the idea of love and mercy are actually human qualities externalized and projected into something outside of himself, something that we relegated to God as a concept. In page 87, second paragraph, let me just read. The problem with this human creation of God is that it depends on human self-denigration. Attributing human traits to God, human beings have disowned their own powers and accordingly have lost awareness of how to use them. Human beings have become estranged or unfamiliar to themselves. Feuerbach urges that we rediscover our own capacities and re-internalize our projected powers. Until we do so, we will continue to be victims of our own conviction that we ourselves are powerless and utterly dependent on that idea of God that we made. That's what in page 88, Nietzsche's case against Christianity depends in large part on his basic acceptance or of Feuerbach's view that human beings invented God by divesting themselves of any sense of their own powers. Through this operation, Nietzsche insists believers exchange an active stance towards their environment for the reactive stance of a pet or a victim. Instead of actively engaging with their problems, they treat their lived experiences like puzzles or hieroglyphics whose real significance is something that they can understand only on a different plane, and that is the supernatural. Nietzsche contends that this shift of focus amounts to a complete falsification of our actual circumstances. He writes, in Christianity, neither morality nor religion has even a single point of contact with reality. Nothing but imaginary causes: God, soul, ego, spirit, free will. For that matter, we become, on free will, nothing but imaginary effects. Sin, redemption, grace, punishment, and forgiveness of sins. For Nietzsche, this outlook is damaging to one's ability to function and flourish in one's life. It obstructs one's view of the real world adults one's ability to see the real forces at work in one's life and destroy one's ability to recognize how best to address them. The imaginary scheme implicit in the Christian worldview is also dangerous for another reason. It interprets suffering as punishment. Just to pause for a while. Just want to make a quick point. Even if you believe in God, and even if you do not believe in God, does suffering exist? I'll let you answer that question. Going back, suffering allegedly entered the world as God's retaliation for Adam and Eve's sin. Nietzsche complains in Daybreak that only in Christendom did everything become punishment, well deserved punishment. It also makes the sufferer's imagination suffer, so that with every misfortune, he feels himself morally reprehensible and cast out. Going to page 90, it says Christianity's repudiation of nature, particularly human nature, is a further target of Nietzsche's attack. According to Nietzsche, Christianity interprets our natural appetites as dangerous temptations. The body is viewed as a source of sin that must be subdued. Even this requires harming it. Nietzsche believes that in addition to encouraging the believer to despise the body's demands, the Christian worldview encourages that our psychological makeup, which naturally seeks self-assertion and self-enhancement, is pernicious. The hostility of our Christianity to our physical and psychological natures is evident in the list of sins that it considers most deadly: pride, envy, greed, gluttony, sloth, lust, and anger. Now, this is the important point, and I want you to listen. These sins are all expressions of natural instincts, presented in their ugliest form. This is the point. Instead of providing techniques for developing self-control in the expression of these urges, Christian morality urges their destruction or outright obliteration. One cannot destroy one's instincts, however, without destroying oneself. Going to page 92, Nietzsche also criticizes Christianity for it encourages believers to see others, and this is a fascinating idea, to see others in a negative light. In order to improve one's own self-assessment, one needs only to look at others with a keen eye for human flaws. Observing the small sins of others, one feels less sinful. Moreover, in the quest for moral superiority, one seeks out sinful behavior in others, taking mere foibles for crimes against God. In this way, then, the Christian outlook in effect creates a popular appetite for sensational scandals, which provide assurance that even if one is depraved, one is still clearly better than certain notorious characters. And this is a fine example of how master morality and slave morality works in Christianity. If you are a rigid or a dogmatic individual, that your religion is the only truth or holds the truth and nothing else, other religions are not true. If you hold that idea, this is actually the way that you're actually thinking it. You look at others in a negative light. Isn't it that one of the important message of Christ is for you to live a life in which you must be more inclusive out of the principle of love, isn't it? Now, going down to the idea of nihilism and how this actually works. The problem of nihilism, or the view that nothing has any meaning, confronts humanity both in the presence or in the belief of God and both in the absence of such God. Within the idea of belief in God, we have Christian nihilism, wherein Christianity robs the earth of its value by the life denying values it promotes. It looks down upon the body and affirms the soul, which prioritizes its journey towards a host beyond this world. Values, as something that Nietzsche emphasized, is intended for you to affirm life and not to deny it. Even in the absence of God, there is nihilism. So Nietzsche is striking a balance here. He is not totally saying that let's get rid of our beliefs. In fact, he actually salvages or saves belief not by um, affirming it entirely, but re-evaluating it by way of looking how it can be reconfigured in our present circumstances. Going back, scientific materialism is nihilistic in the sense that if you take, for example, the outlook of the scientist, um, it robs the idea that there is any spirit to human life, since it reduces an understanding of life as a miniature atom, just a matter without a spirit. Life has no meaning and purpose. Imagine that you're born as an accident and you will also die by chance. So, what a negative view of life that is. So, Nietzsche's spiritual alternative, and this is something that somehow salvages or saves our faith or belief in God. You cannot restore faith by completely relying on faith alone. It needs certain actions in order for it to work. And part of that action is, as Nietzsche's spiritual alternative, is to affirm life. We should not search for blessedness in the infinite. Instead, let us ground our heaven on earth. To live life and to learn how to love life requires one to touch it. The great danger of modern nihilism is that it will lead not to the promotion of higher types of man or individuals, but leads to the opposite. A leveling. When you say leveling out, it's within the same level. And homogenization, in which social and political institutions will exist simply to control or contain man. What is done out of love is beyond good and evil. And that's a powerful quote from Nietzsche that I love. Now, let's take a look at one case on that idea of affirming life and how certain values in the Christian morality seems to devaluate themselves. That idea of what God put together, man cannot put asunder. That idea of divorce. My question is, are you in favor of divorce or are you not in favor of divorce? Let's take, for example, this one. Let's say you hold the idea of predetermination, that you are destined or God destined you to marry this individual, and you will walk down that aisle and you will become one flesh. And then 2 years after your marriage, your husband is beating you. Is that God what intended you to have? Is that God's justice? would you still hold the idea that this is the man that God gave you? Someone who will beat you your entire life, or who knows? So, this is something that I want you to reconsider. In the light of Nietzsche's message, you would see that ideas of good and evil are not definite categories or simple categories, that we have good on the other side and evil on the other side. These concepts needs to be reevaluated on the uniqueness of the present circumstances or the actualities that we are actually facing. How are you supposed to flourish as an individual within that context that you are beaten by your husband? So, again, in summary, Nietzsche's main ideas: there is no absolute unchanging truth. There is a plurality of truth claims. Morality is a human creation. There is no objective claim for it. It is historically grounded. Moral valuations is wielded by power, the power to mold it, the power to create it. Nietzsche's philosophy is a counter movement. A counter movement to the condition of nihilism, where meaning is somehow absent in our lives. And he wants to motivate us to create or lead a meaningful life by creating or owning up the responsibility of creating them. A renewed spiritual affirmation of this life and not a host beyond. The task of any individual is a continuous self-development of oneself, or cultivation of oneself. To end this presentation, Nietzsche said, all things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. End of quote. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and this is something that I am completely passionate about, because Nietzsche is one of my favorite thinkers. And for me personally, I find Nietzsche's philosophy as life affirming, both in the way that I view religion. I may not now believe, somehow Nietzsche influenced me in this way, I may not believe in a host beyond or in a heaven beyond, but I reconfigured that idea of heaven as something that waits in an afterlife into something that can be done in this life. Heaven is something that doesn't wait. Heaven is something that needs to be embraced and made in this life while you're still living and breathing it. As an agnostic, I'm not even sure if there's an afterlife. What I am sure of is I can affirm my life here, and Christian belief, to be selective about it, some of its features actually motivate me to affirm this life. And reinterpreting theology through Nietzsche's philosophy is indeed liberating. I like the idea of Nietzsche that hardships is an essential feature of one's development. That idea of no pain, no gain. You cannot build muscles without pain. That's another way to put it. So, even in the process of learning, this is an essential feature for you to say that you went through it all, and your status now, in the end, is something worth it, something real, and something not abstract, something not only written in paper that you are a cum laude or magna cum laude or summa cum laude. How do you own up to that title is something that Nietzsche wants us to reconsider. Can we own up that title if we haven't gone through that hardship? If we went to the route or path of having things in an easy way. So that's that's some of the points that I love about Nietzsche. And in fact, this is actually connected to the next discussion, which is virtue ethics of Aristotle, which is about which focuses on the idea of developing the character of an individual to assess actual circumstances, and how to address them in an ethical way. This is also connected to the lesson, does morality depend on religion? And I will encourage you guys to actually read that good chapter in James and Stuart Rachel's book, The Elements of Moral Philosophy. So this is it for now. This is a long lecture, and I thank you guys for staying with me throughout the 50 or more so minutes of my lecture. And I apologize for the long lecture, but I hope you find it worthwhile and worth it. Goodbye, and see you again in the next lecture. Carpe diem.